My daughter said I was a burden and kicked me out, so I bought her building and raised the rent. Grace Thompson sat at the worn kitchen table of her modest Portland home, the pale morning light casting soft shadows across the faded wallpaper. Her hands, slightly calloused from years of grading papers and tending her small garden, trembled as she clutched a mug of lukewarm coffee. At 52, life hadn't gifted her many luxuries. Yet, despite the creases etched deep into her face and the gray streaks weaving through her once rich brown hair, there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, a resilience shaped by decades of sacrifice. For as long as Grace could remember, her world revolved around Madison, her only daughter. From the moment Madison took her first breath, Grace devoted her life to providing a shelter of love and stability. As a public school teacher, Grace worked tirelessly, juggling extra shifts and tutoring after classes to keep the household afloat. She wasn't a woman of means nor of glamorous dreams, but every penny saved and every sleepless night was an offering to the future she hoped Madison would have, a life Grace herself had never dared to imagine. But that future seemed to be slipping farther and farther away. Madison, now 25 and freshly minted with a degree in marketing from one of Portland's state universities, had always been fiercely ambitious. Over time, that fierce ambition had morphed into something harder to bear: sharp words, cold eyes, and a growing disdain for the mother who'd raised her so humbly. What once was warm closeness chilled into a strained, almost antagonistic silence. This tension had been simmering under the surface for months, thinly veiled by polite smiles during family dinners that felt anything but familial. Grace had tried to ignore the subtle digs, the impatient sighs, and the way Madison's gaze drifted away whenever she spoke about her hopes or struggles. But nothing prepared her for what was to come. It happened during a dinner at a friend's house, a small gathering meant to celebrate Madison's recent job promotion. Surrounded by the chatter of acquaintances and the clink of wine glasses, Madison's frustrations burst forth like a sudden storm. The words struck with brutal force. "You're a burden, Mom," she spat, voice low but cutting. "I can't build my life with you hanging around, weighing me down." Grace felt her heart shatter. The room seemed to still, breaths held tight as Madison's accusations echoed amid the startled silence from the guests. The youngest daughter she'd nurtured, the one she'd stayed awake worrying about through teenage heartbreaks and late-night projects, now openly dismissed her like a worn-out garment she no longer wished to wear. "I should have never let you live here." Madison sneered, rising abruptly. "Get out." The humiliation rolled over Grace like a wave. Her cheeks burned and her eyes stung, but she fought back tears, not just for herself, but for the stunned faces watching the unraveling of their mother-daughter bond. Collecting what little she had in a trembling bag, Grace rose quietly, each step heavy with disbelief and sorrow. The door closed behind her with a hollow finality, leaving behind a house that once cradled shared dreams, now filled only with fractured memories. Outside, the damp air bit at her skin, but it was the cold emptiness inside her chest that echoed loudest. Humiliated and rejected, she wandered the streets, her mind spinning with the sharp sting of betrayal. How had love transformed into contempt so swiftly? How did the woman she had raised with everything she had become the same person who saw her as nothing but a burden? Beneath the stars dimmed by city lights, Grace's world felt as though it had crumbled, but somewhere deep inside, a flicker of defiance quietly ignited, refusing to be extinguished. The days that followed the sharp, cutting words at the dinner party were a blur of aching silence and endless self-questioning for Grace. The sting of Madison's rejection wasn't just a fleeting wound. It dug deep, embedding itself where her heart once beat with warmth and certainty. Each morning, as sunlight crept through her small apartment's curtained windows, she would sit alone, the quiet pressing in. amplifying every echo of that humiliating night. The world seemed to have shrunk to the bare walls around her, mirroring the isolation she felt within. Friends and neighbors who once greeted her with genuine smiles now avoided eye contact or offered shallow platitudes that barely hid their whispered judgments. Word had traveled fast, and the story of Grace's expulsion from her own home fueled a subtle undercurrent of gossip. It was as though the community's eyes, once soft with familiarity, now held cold scrutiny, questioning how a mother who had sacrificed so much could be so thoroughly discarded by her own daughter. Grace bore the weight of those stares, their silent accusations far more painful than any spoken word. But it was the way Madison seemed to thrive on her pain that cut deepest. Social media posts flaunted her newly acquired independence, pictures of chic lofts, gatherings with polished friends, advancements at work, all seemingly designed to underscore a life unburdened by maternal obligation. Grace felt herself shrinking beneath the waves of pride that radiated from her daughter's polished persona, a painful contrast to Grace's own modest existence. It was clear Madison wanted nothing to tie her down, nothing that reminded her of the humble woman her mother was. The loneliness wrapped tighter around Grace's shoulders as she grappled with more practical concerns. With no home and a dwindling savings account, every decision felt like a precarious step on a fraying tightrope. The rent on her apartment demanded payment with little room to spare, and her teaching job barely offered a financial cushion. She considered reaching out to Madison, seeking reconciliation, or at least an honest conversation, but old memories of biting remarks and public humiliation made her hesitant. Every attempt to call or message was met with cold silence, or worse, curt dismissal. This deepening chasm enraged some of Grace's closest friends, who saw the injustice with clear eyes. One afternoon, as they sat in the local coffee shop, her best friend, Karen, squeezed her hand gently, voice laced with quiet determination. "You deserve better than this," she said, her gaze firm. "Madison's wrong to treat you like you're a burden. You're a gift, Grace. Don't let her make you forget that." The words helped, even if only slightly, fanning the fragile embers of Grace's resolve. She knew she couldn't let herself be defined by Madison's cruel rejection or the whispers that followed her everywhere. But the question burned fiercely in her mind. How do you reclaim your worth in the eyes of someone who no longer sees you as valuable? When she scrolled through social media late one night, seeking any sign of warmth or understanding from Madison, a startling realization struck her. Madison had opened a new boutique downtown, renting space in a building Grace had passed by countless times. A small, brick-faced structure with large glass windows and a prominent "for sale" sign now affixed to its corner. The thought stirred something unexpected within Grace, a spark of possibility, a chance to regain some semblance of control in a narrative that so far had been written by Madison's hands alone. Despite her dwindling funds and a heart aching with hesitation, Grace began asking discreet questions about the property's sale. The local real estate agent, a cheerful man named Tom, spoke of the building with fond regard, noting its potential and recent interest from various investors. Something about the idea of owning the place where Madison's high-heeled footsteps carried disdain for her mother touched a nerve. Grace imagined herself standing in the shadow of that building, no longer powerless, but an owner with quiet strength. Her friends, at first surprised by her newfound determination, quickly rallied behind her. "You've got this, Grace," Karen said, clutching her hand once more. "Show the world and Madison that strength doesn't come from youth or money alone. It comes from the heart." In the darkest moments after the dinner party, when tears had soaked her pillow and cracks in her will threatened to become fractures, this glimmer of hope was the lifeline Grace clung to. She wasn't ready to give up, not on herself, and not on the chance to prove to Madison that true strength is more than just independence. It's the quiet courage to rise despite heartbreak. If you ever find yourself at the mercy of others' harsh judgments, remember Grace's journey, from the depths of humiliation toward a path of quiet empowerment. It's a painful yet essential lesson about the resilience that lies within all of us, waiting to be awakened. And this is only the beginning. With a fragile blend of hope and uncertainty, Grace began piecing together a plan to reclaim not only her dignity, but a measure of control over her fractured life. She kept the news of the building's availability close to her chest, sharing only with Karen and a handful of trusted friends who offered quiet encouragement. Yet beneath the surface of this fragile hope, each day brought new obstacles that tested her resolve. Grace's savings were modest, accumulated carefully over years of scrimping and living simply. The cost of the building was steep, but the idea of owning the very place that had become a symbol of her daughter's rejection was a magnetic, unyielding pull. She spent evenings poring over paperwork, calling financial advisors, and meeting with mortgage lenders, whose skeptical expressions mirrored the doubts that sometimes nibbled at her confidence. "Are you sure you can afford this?" one broker asked gently, the unspoken message lurking beneath the words making Grace's heart tighten with worry. She faced setbacks that made her question the path she was on. An unexpected repair bill on her small apartment drained some of her reserves. A missed paycheck due to a substitute teaching assignment gone awry added to her stress. At times, exhaustion would wash over her, leaving her aching in ways that no hurtful words ever could. But amidst this weight, there were moments that reminded Grace of the power within. A kind note from a student, a warm smile from a colleague, the gentle encouragement of her friends. Each small spark kept the darkness at bay. The hardest part was resisting the urge to reach out to Madison again, to beg for understanding or forgiveness. Grace knew those calls might fall on deaf ears or ignite fresh rounds of rejection. So she stayed silent, channeling her energy into the purchase, preparing mentally for the day when she would claim her unexpected victory. When at last the closing date arrived, Grace found herself standing inside the building. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long ribbons of light across the worn wooden floor. Dust motes floated like tiny stars caught in the shaft of light. It was quiet, save for the faint hum of city life outside. Here, in this modest brick building she'd come to know by heart through countless visits and conversations, Grace felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in months, a deep-rooted sense of agency. Yet even as she tried to savor this victory, doubt lingered. Would Madison understand the message Grace intended to send? Would this move deepen the divide or open a pathway toward reconciliation? Grace steeled herself for both possibilities. Meanwhile, Madison's life bustled with excitement and renewed focus. At her boutique, she oversaw inventory and chatted with customers, her demeanor confident, almost buoyant. She occasionally mentioned her mother, but with a dismissive tone, as if the pain from their last confrontation had been neatly packaged and locked away. She had no idea the storm that was quietly brewing just a few blocks away. As weeks passed, Grace noted the subtle but sharp increase in her own anxiety, a byproduct of the balancing act between hope and fear. Every time she heard about a rent hike or a business's troubles downtown, she wondered if Madison's life was beginning to unravel. She didn't desire her daughter's downfall, yet part of her longed for Madison to recognize the consequence of her own actions. The first notice of rent increase was a quiet letter slipped under the boutique's door, a formality wrapped in legal language, but carrying a message loud and clear. Madison found it impossible to ignore the sudden change, her eyes narrowing as she read each line. The terms shifted aggressively, the figures soaring beyond her expectations. A toxic mixture of shock and anger bubbled beneath her carefully maintained composure. Grace watched from afar as Madison's confident facade cracked. Though her heart ached for the daughter she loved, the sight kindled a quiet satisfaction, a reminder that strength was not reserved for the young or privileged. There were lessons to be learned here, and perhaps this was the wake-up call Madison needed. Still, Grace knew this path was fraught with pain for both of them. The tighter the noose of circumstance, the clearer it became that there was no easy way forward. No matter the outcome, Grace's journey underscored an essential truth. Healing and growth are often born from struggle, and those who choose to rise after being cast down hold a power that words alone cannot define. She was stepping beyond humiliation and into a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty but also simmering potential. If you ever find yourself weighed down by setbacks and moments of doubt, remember, Grace's story shows us that patience, resolve, and a willingness to face discomfort head-on can lead us towards surprising new possibilities. Keep holding on. The next chapter may be just around the corner. The tension between mother and daughter reached a crescendo neither had anticipated. Madison's boutique had always been her sanctuary, an emblem of independence and ambition, the very antithesis of everything Grace represented in her eyes. But the sudden spike in rent transformed that sanctuary into a pressure cooker. Business slowed, bills piled up. The once vibrant shop, filled with the buzz of chatter and laughter, grew quieter. The shelves a little emptier each week. Staff were let go, and customers whispered about the boutique's troubles behind Madison's back. Madison's frustration erupted in sharp words aimed at her employees, and in private, seethed into bitter reflections about her mother. "This is a betrayal," she confided to a close friend over coffee, her fingers clenched tightly around the ceramic mug. "After everything, this is how she repays me? She wants me to fail." There was fury, yes, but beneath it lay a tangled sprawl of wounded pride and a gnawing sense of vulnerability. Feelings Madison struggled mightily to admit, even to herself. Meanwhile, Grace wrestled with her own conflicted emotions. The satisfaction she initially felt was shadowed by regret and exhaustion. She never wanted this to be a battle of vengeance. Her aim had been to reclaim some dignity, to send a wake-up call, wrapped in a lesson about respect and gratitude. Yet seeing the strain etched on Madison's face pierced her heart. Anxiety gnawed at her as she wondered if her stance was pushing her daughter beyond reach. One overcast morning, Grace sat on the stoop of the building, the chill in the air mirroring the cold distance growing between them. Passers-by hurried along the sidewalks, indifferent to the quiet war unfolding inside those brick walls. She thought back to the dinner party, to the moment Madison cast her out with words heavy enough to crush dreams. The memory was raw, a jagged wound unhealed. She allowed herself a moment of tears, silent and unashamed. But beneath the sorrow rose a fierce resolve. Grace refused to be broken. She was no longer the helpless woman who had been cast aside, but a quiet force, steady, unwavering. Her struggle to maintain her own home, pay her own bills, and now oversee a building that held both hardship and hope, had taught her that strength wasn't about dominance, but endurance. At the same time, the community's whispers became louder. Some sympathized with Grace, recognizing the injustice she had endured. Others sided with Madison, dazzled by youth and ambition. The local social media pages buzzed with heated debates, strangers weighing in with opinions that cut deeply in both directions. Grace's private pain had become a public spectacle, the unfolding drama a modern-day morality play about family, pride, and redemption. Karen, ever stalwart at her side, encouraged her not to retaliate further. "Two wrongs won't heal this, Grace," she cautioned gently. "The real victory is in rising above, not in sinking deeper." Her words echoed in Grace's mind as she wrestled with every interaction, deciding where to draw lines and when to extend a hand. One evening, after receiving yet another terse message from Madison, dismissing any attempt at dialogue, Grace found herself at her lowest point. She sat alone in her small apartment, the silence pressing down like an unbearable weight. The loneliness was palpable. The dream of reconciliation seemed more like a distant star, beautiful yet impossibly far. Yet even in this dark pit, Grace's spirit flickered with quiet hope. She understood now that healing is rarely linear. Sometimes, getting rock bottom is the prelude to a profound transformation. And though the chasm between her and her daughter seemed vast, Grace would not abandon the hope that one day they could bridge it. This is a chapter many know too well, the moment when humiliation feels unbearable and the soul aches under the weight of injustice. It's here, in this crucible of pain, that true character is forged. If you have ever felt cast out, remember that darkness can be the birthplace of your strongest self, and sometimes the hardest battles precede the most meaningful breakthroughs. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. Grace was no longer a victim. She was a woman claiming her own worth in a world that had tried to diminish her. And the story was far from over. If you're feeling overwhelmed by hardship, know that moments of despair can be the turning point. Grace's story teaches us this. Resilience isn't about how many times you get knocked down, but how even in the depths of pain, you find the courage to stand tall and prepare for the change that's just beyond the horizon. Let's discover it together. After the crushing fallout of the town's whispered judgment and the relentless public unraveling of everything she'd worked for, Jessica found herself at a crossroads unlike any before. The cold night air bit into her as she sat on the worn steps of the small cafe where her humiliation had first escalated, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a faded photo of her late grandmother, a woman whose resilience had often been her secret refuge. Her eyes traced the worn edges of the photograph, searching for some intangible strength passed through the generations. The days blurred into a tedious cycle of avoidance and whispered rumors, each morning heavier than the last. Jessica's once vibrant world had shrunk to the confines of her modest apartment, where silence was the only companion left untouched by betrayal. The bright canvases she once painted with passion stood covered, forgotten, as if her creativity had been silenced by the weight of shame. But beneath the shadows, flickers of quiet determination stirred. During one bleak afternoon, as rain pelted the windowpane, Jessica's phone buzzed with an unexpected message, a simple note from Olivia, the local librarian. "Saw what happened. You don't deserve their cruelty. If you want coffee tomorrow?" Sometimes new beginnings start with small talks. Jessica's breath caught. She hesitated, the old wounds raw. But something in the invitation felt like a lifeline. The following morning, tentative but desperate for any anchor, she arrived at the cozy corner of Bright Oak's library. Olivia greeted her with a worn smile, the kind that held no judgment, only understanding. As the two spoke over steaming mugs, Jessica's story poured out. The betrayals, the public ignominy, the loneliness. Olivia listened, her eyes reflecting genuine empathy. She shared tales of others who'd stumbled, been crushed but found their footing again. "You don't have to face this alone," Olivia insisted. "Sometimes the darkest valleys lead to the highest peaks." In the days that followed, Jessica forced herself out of her comfort zone. She revisited the community center, initially to return a book, but ended up joining an art therapy group. The walls, once cold and intimidating, began to feel a bit more like home. Here, amid strangers who understood heartache in their own ways, Jessica saw the possibility of reclaiming her voice, yet the battle was far from over. One afternoon, as she gathered her courage to display a small painting at a local exhibit, she encountered Maddie, the architect of her public disgrace. Maddie's smirk was as sharp as ever, a reminder that while Jessica was inching toward healing, the wounds inflicted by others still throbbed beneath the surface. Their brief exchange was ice and fire. Sarcasm met quiet resolve. But Jessica walked away without turning back, her chin slightly uplifted, the embers of self-respect flickering. At night, journaling became her solace. She began recording not just pain, but hope, little victories and small acts of kindness she experienced. This new habit nurtured her spirit, reminding her of the inner light that once burned bright and could do so again. The turning point lingered on the horizon, subtle yet potent. Jessica felt the beginning of a transformation, a slow but undeniable shift in her perspective. The focus was no longer on the cruelty that sought to define her, but on the strength that could reshape her destiny. It was a fragile thread, but one she was finally ready to grasp. In this delicate space between despair and rejuvenation, Jessica faced her reflection one quiet evening. The woman staring back bore the scars of recent battles, but also the promise of renewal. She whispered a vow to rise beyond the echoes of humiliation, to rebuild not just her reputation, but her very self, built on the pillars of kindness, authenticity, and courage. Each step forward was still uncertain, and though the road ahead awaited with its own challenges, Jessica no longer felt alone. And in the gentle glow of that realization, hope began to weave itself into the fabric of her story, promising that even the darkest nights held the dawn of a new day. If you've ever faced moments where the world seemed to crumble around you, remember that reaching out and allowing yourself the grace of new connections can light the way forward. Sometimes the smallest gesture can ignite the fiercest hope. The day the community center's annual art exhibit opened felt peculiar to Jessica. The way the autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting golden beams that seemed almost like a silent applause. She'd spent weeks secretly preparing a single painting, a vibrant portrayal of a phoenix rising from ashes, a metaphor that had come to embody her fragile but fierce spirit. Displaying it on the humble walls among other local artists felt like stepping onto uncertain ground, vulnerable yet determined. As she adjusted the frame, a sudden hush swept across the room. Jessica noticed heads turning, whispers rippling like a quiet storm. Then, to her shock, Maddie entered, her presence commanding as she sauntered toward the crowd's epicenter. The same face that had so publicly torn Jessica down now bore an expression twisted between disbelief and something else. A shadow of doubt, maybe even regret. Jessica's heart pounded, but her outward composure remained steady as a hushed crowd began to focus on her. The whispers grew louder, not mocking, but curiously admiring. Someone gasped softly, "That painting, it's incredible." It wasn't mere praise. It carried the weight of surprise and newfound respect. Suddenly, Olivia appeared beside her, whispering, "You've changed the narrative. People are seeing the real you." Jessica felt a slow smile break through, a tangible warmth she hadn't felt since everything fell apart. But the moment that truly transformed everything was yet to come. Maddie, visibly unsettled, cleared her throat and approached Jessica. "Look, I owe you an apology," she mumbled, eyes avoiding direct contact. The confessions hadn't come easily to the woman who once thrived on dominance and ridicule. But the public setting seemed to have cracked her armor. Jessica stared, the sudden weight of that rare humility hanging between them like fragile glass. She could have retaliated, exposed every whispered intent, every calculated humiliation. But instead, she chose silence. This unspoken grace only amplified the shift in energy around the room. Then, Maddie took a step back and nodded to the crowd. "I was wrong to treat you like that. Your strength is admirable." The audience murmured, absorbing words that dismantled the walls of old narratives. The atmosphere shifted from judgment to reflection, from cruelty to empathy. Jessica's breath caught as she realized this moment wasn't just her personal victory, but a ripple in the community's heartbeat. The people who had once sided blindfolded were now questioning their own complicity in the cruelty they watched unfold. Later, as the evening waned and the crowd thinned, Olivia and Jessica sat in quiet companionship. "Your courage changed the story," Olivia said softly, stirring her tea. "Not because you fought fire with fire, but because you shone brighter than their darkness." Jessica felt a quiet resolve cement within her. The revelation that true power wasn't in retaliation, but in kindness and resilience had finally materialized before her very eyes. She realized that sometimes the most profound victories unfold not through dramatic confrontations, but through steadfast grace and authentic strength. By the end of the night, messages began flooding Jessica's phone. Notes of encouragement, apologies from those who'd been silent, and new connections forged from shared respect. The community's attitude was shifting, and with it, Jessica's place within it. This pivotal moment underscored a timeless lesson about the power of empathy and the courage it takes to forgive, even when wronged deeply. As she looked at her painting once more, illuminated softly by the fading light, Jessica knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one she would write with integrity, confidence, and a heart unburdened by past shadows. If you've ever encountered those who doubted or hurt you, remember that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in retaliation, but in choosing kindness and resilience. It's in these choices we find our true power and inspire others around us. In the days that followed the art exhibit, the quiet transformations Jessica had glimpsed began to ripple outward with growing strength. The community that once shunned her now observed her with renewed curiosity and gradually respect. Whispers shifted from cruel gossip to honest conversations about courage, redemption, and the complexity of human mistakes. Jessica, once silenced by humiliation, found her voice emerging with clarity and compassion. Invitations came unexpectedly, requests to speak at local gatherings, to share her story with youth groups, to participate in panels about resilience and mental health. Each opportunity, while daunting at first, became affirmations of her renewed worth and purpose. One afternoon, Jessica stood before a small crowd at a neighborhood center, sharing her journey candidly. Her eyes scanned the faces, some familiar, some new. She spoke of pain and vulnerability, but also of strength forged through adversity, the importance of kindness in the face of cruelty, and the power of choosing forgiveness over bitterness. Midway through her talk, a woman from the back raised her hand hesitantly. "How did you keep going when everything felt like it was falling apart?" Jessica's gaze softened. "I realized that the pain I felt wasn't the end of my story. It was a call to rebuild, not just for myself, but for others who might be broken in silence. Connecting with people who cared reminded me I wasn't alone." As days turned to weeks, Maddie, who had once been a source of anguish, began to show a different face. The antagonism faded into awkward but genuine attempts at reconciliation, culminating in a heartfelt conversation that no longer carried the poison of past grudges, but the possibility of mutual understanding. Through all this, Jessica's art continued to flourish, each brushstroke an expression of feeling and hope. Her paintings, now celebrated for their raw emotion and vibrant life, became symbols of transformation, not only her own, but of a community learning to embrace empathy. The justice she'd long yearned for was not delivered through punishment or retribution, but through a collective awakening, an acknowledgement of past mistakes, and a shared responsibility to foster kindness. Jessica's strength lay not in erasing what had happened, but in confronting it with grace and courage. A particularly poignant moment came when Jessica was invited to curate a gallery exhibition dedicated to stories of overcoming adversity. Standing amidst the works of artists who had all faced their own battles, she felt deeply connected to a larger narrative of resilience and hope. The sense of relief that settled in her chest was profound. The wounds, though still tender, no longer defined her. Instead, they were threads woven into a tapestry of growth and discovery. At night, as she sat quietly in her studio, Jessica reflected on the profound journey she had undertaken. From the depths of humiliation and despair, she had risen, stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. The journey had reshaped her, not just externally, but in the very core of who she was. Her story became a beacon to those navigating their own storms, a testament to the power of perseverance and kindness. The vindication she once sought in others' recognition was now deeply rooted within herself. Jessica knew this was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter marked by authenticity and unwavering self-respect. Every step forward was a promise to live boldly, to heal openly, and to extend the same grace she had found onto others. In reclaiming her narrative, Jessica discovered that true justice is often quiet and gentle. It's the triumph of the human spirit over the trials life presents, the ability to turn scars into strength and loneliness into connection. When you face seemingly insurmountable challenges, know that your resilience can lead to more than survival. It can be the foundation of transformation. Justice is most powerful when it is kind, and strength is most radiant when it's fueled by compassion and forgiveness. The day the community center's annual art exhibit opened felt peculiar to Jessica. The way the autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting golden beams that seemed almost like a silent applause. She'd spent weeks secretly preparing a single painting, a vibrant portrayal of a phoenix rising from ashes, a metaphor that had come to embody her fragile but fierce spirit. Displaying it on the humble walls among other local artists felt like stepping onto uncertain ground, vulnerable yet determined. As she adjusted the frame, a sudden hush swept across the room. Jessica noticed heads turning, whispers rippling like a quiet storm. Then, to her shock, Natty entered, her presence commanding as she sauntered toward the crowd's epicenter. The same face that had so publicly torn Jessica down now bore an expression twisted between disbelief and something else. A shadow of doubt, maybe even regret. Jessica's heart pounded, but her outward composure remained steady as a hushed crowd began to focus on her. The whispers grew louder, not mocking, but curiously admiring. Someone gasped softly, "That painting, it's incredible." It wasn't mere praise. It carried the weight of surprise and newfound respect. Suddenly, Olivia appeared beside her, whispering, "You've changed the narrative. People are seeing the real you." Jessica felt a slow smile break through, a tangible warmth she hadn't felt since everything fell apart. But the moment that truly transformed everything was yet to come. Maddie, visibly unsettled, cleared her throat and approached Jessica. "Look, I owe you an apology," she mumbled, eyes avoiding direct contact. The confessions hadn't come easily to the woman who once thrived on dominance and ridicule. But the public setting seemed to have cracked her armor. Jessica stared, the sudden weight of that rare humility hanging between them like fragile glass. She could have retaliated, exposed every whispered intent, every calculated humiliation. But instead, she chose silence. This unspoken grace only amplified the shift in energy around the room. Then, Natty took a step back and nodded to the crowd. "I was wrong to treat you like that. Your strength is admirable." The audience murmured, absorbing words that dismantled the walls of old narratives. The atmosphere shifted from judgment to reflection, from cruelty to empathy. Jessica's breath caught as she realized this moment wasn't just her personal victory, but a ripple in the community's heartbeat. The people who had once sided blindfolded were now questioning their own complicity in the cruelty they watched unfold. Later, as the evening waned and the crowd thinned, Olivia and Jessica sat in quiet companionship. "Your courage changed the story," Olivia said softly, stirring her tea. "Not because you fought fire with fire, but because you shone brighter than their darkness." Jessica felt a quiet resolve cement within her. The revelation that true power wasn't in retaliation, but in kindness and resilience, had finally materialized before her very eyes. She realized that sometimes the most profound victories unfold not through dramatic confrontations, but through steadfast grace and authentic strength. By the end of the night, messages began flooding Jessica's phone. Notes of encouragement, apologies from those who'd been silent, and new connections forged from shared respect. The community's attitude was shifting, and with it, Jessica's place within it. This pivotal moment underscored a timeless lesson about the power of empathy and the courage it takes to forgive even when wronged deeply. As she looked at her painting once more, illuminated softly by the fading light, Jessica knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one she would write with integrity, confidence, and a heart unburdened by past shadows. If you've ever encountered those who doubted or hurt you, remember that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in retaliation, but in choosing kindness and resilience. It's in these choices we find our true power and inspire others around us.